Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Australia Day in 1982, a young man named Tuan van Nguyen arrived in Australia as a refugee. Like many refugees arriving in Australia at the time, he started his life here in Australia with only the shirt on his back and not a penny in his pocket. Tuan van Nguyen was born and raised in a small village in the Mekong Delta region of South Vietnam. His parents were rice farmers and they placed a strong emphasis on education. These values would serve Tuan, his adopted country, and eventually the scientific and medical communities across the world extremely well. Following his studies, he spent over 30 years at the Garvan Institute of Medical Research. His association with the institute began with an interview with Professor John Eisman, who convinced him that working in medical research could help millions of people. At the time, the Dubbo osteoporosis epidemiology study had just commenced, and Professor Eisman needed an epidemiologist and a biostatistician to work on the study. Tuan was capable of both of these jobs and secured this role while completing his PhD from this study. In this time, he further developed his interest in why people have osteoporosis, what causes bone fracture, and how to predict the risk of fracture for an individual. His research program is driven by the hypothesis that an individual's susceptibility to fracture is determined by reduced bone strength due to bone loss and deteriorated bone structure, and that bone loss and bone structure are primarily determined by genetic factors. At this time, the link between osteoporosis and genetic factors was relatively unheard of. Osteoporosis is a common bone disease that affects 1/3 of women and 1/10 of men aged 50 years and older and causes bone fractures. These fractures increase the risk of premature mortality and in turn reduce life expectancy. The overall goal of Tuan van Nguyen's research is to improve life expectancy for people impacted by osteoporosis and to empower people to take preventative actions to reduce their own risk of osteoporosis. In the year 2000, he became the leader of the genetics and epidemiology of the osteoporosis lab at the Garvan Institute. His research defined the relationship between fracture and mortality and included the discovery of genes that contribute to the risk of fracture. One of his achievements in the translation of 20 years of research into a prognostic tool called the Garvan Fracture Risk Calculator for assessing fracture risk for an individual. The model has been implemented in mobile devices and a dedicated website that has been used by doctors and patients from all over the world. Mr. Nguyen has published more than 320 peer-reviewed publications, and some of his papers are considered pioneering and have received applauded commentaries. Mr. Nguyen's papers have also been cited over 32,000 times, and he is one of the most highly cited scientists in the field of osteoporosis and medicine and regularly speaks at lectures and major osteoporosis conferences. During the past 15 years, he has conducted many workshops in osteoporosis, evidence-based medicine, research methodology, scientific writing, epidemiology and biostatistics in Thailand and Vietnam. His highly popular workshops have attracted and improved research capacity for thousands of doctors, healthcare professionals and scientists. He has also contributed to grant review for many funding agencies around the world. He has supervised 15 PhD students, including 4 in Vietnam, who are now successful and independent researchers. Currently, Mr. Nguyen is supervising 3 PhD students, and his students have published their work in high-profile journals and have won national and international prizes. Mr. Nguyen has collaborated extensively both nationally and internationally with his research, and he has been appointed a distinguished visiting professor at many universities abroad. I'm very happy to talk to the House today, Mr. Speaker, about Professor Nguyen, as on this year's Australia Day, exactly 40 years to the day after his arrival in Australia, Mr. Nguyen was made a member of the Order of Australia for his significant service to medical research, to osteoporosis and fracture prevention, and to tertiary education. Professor Nguyen is a stellar example of our successful multicultural nation and a wonderful example of the many successful migrant stories of the Vietnamese community that live in my electorate of East Hills, and I congratulate him on this Australia Day honour and commend him on his decades of research and work.